In our last video, we discussed responder correlation, which allowed us to make our virtual service dynamic. In this video, we're going to explore a different strategy for making our virtual service dynamic called data source correlation. This will allow a single virtual service to support a large number of regression tests. So let's actually create an entirely new virtual service so we can leave my old one intact. And this one is going to be called Hello World DS. And just like before, we're going to create an empty virtual service to start, and we're going to build it from the ground up here. Now, unlike last time, we're only going to have a single responder, and that responder is going to handle every possible request and provide different responses for each request. So to accomplish that, we're actually going to start by creating a data source. To add a data source, I just have to right-click on my responder suite and say Add New Data Source. And I have a number of different options here. It can be something external like a CSV file. It can be an Excel document, even a database that we're querying with a SQL statement. Now, in this particular example, I'm just going to use an in-tool table to make it a little easier. So we're going to have two columns of my data source. One is going to be called ID, and the other is going to be called message. The IDs I'm going to put in here to start are 1, 2, and 3, and the messages are going to be foo bar, and then finally foo bar. Okay, we're going to specify the first row is the column name and give my data source a little name here. Now we're going to create a responder that can actually use this data source in order to perform data source correlation. So to do that, I'm going to add a responder, right-click on the responder suite, add new responder, and like before, it's going to be a JSON message responder. We're going to add an element here, which is going to be my message element. And before we actually put in fixed values for my message element in my response, however, I now have a data source, and in my data source, I actually have a column for this message field. So we're going to parameterize this against that column. So say we'll click on the drop down here and choose parameterize, and then select my messages column. Now, however, here's the problem. I selected the messages column in my data source, but you might remember that I have 3 different possible kinds of messages. I have foo, bar, and foo bar. How does my responder know which one to put into my message field? Well, that's where data source correlation is going to come into the picture. So back in my responder, you'll notice that one of the tabs I have is actually called data source correlation. So if I click on that, you'll see that we can specify what property or what attribute to pull out of my incoming request in order to do the lookup in my data source. To be consistent with my previous video, we're going to use a URL parameter called ID. So in this area here, the URL parameters, we're going to add a parameter called ID, and we're going to say that this parameter actually maps to my ID column in my data source. I saved it. Everything is configured correctly in my responder now. Just to kind of confirm that we understand exactly what's happening here, let me talk through a scenario. So let's say that an ID, a request comes in with URL parameter ID equal to 2. What the responder will do is take that ID value. It knows that that ID maps to ID in my data source, and it'll do a lookup until it finds matching ID 2, and then it'll know that the message is bar, so it'll put that in my message element in my response. So now that everything's set up, let's just go ahead and test this out in my browser. So I'm going to bring up my browser, and we're going to go ahead and invoke my virtual service I just created. So to get to it, it's going to be Hello World DS with a URL parameter. So you can see ID 1 is actually returning foo from my data source. ID 2 is returning bar, and ID 3 is should return foo bar. So it looks like it's working. So you might remember from my previous video that we had a situation where when we put in ID 4, there was no responder that could handle that correlation. And we have a very similar situation now. In my data source, I only specified ID 1, 2, and 3. So if I put in ID 4, what's going to happen? Well, you can see that it's giving us some sort of error. It's telling us that there's no value in the data source that can respond to ID equal to 4. So we're going to fix this by actually creating a catch-all inside my data source in one of the rows. To do that, I'm going to open up the data source again inside Virtualize. And in the final row here, we're going to put some syntax. It's going to be brackets with an asterisk in the center. And what that means is no matter what the value is, correlate on this row. So it can be anything. And then the message is going to be catch-all. Now, by the way, in terms of this syntax, there are other things we can do. We could also use the less than operator. We could use the greater than operator in order to handle a little bit more complex logic. All right, so we've set up my catch-all. Let's just finish here by going back to the browser and refreshing this. And you can see now that I'm getting a catch-all for any value that's not explicitly specified inside my data source.